We're going to listen to Attorney William Barr in the Justice Department Oversight hearing today. They are on a 5-minute break. It's running for a couple of hours. William Barr is something else, you guys. But I figured the way to get my frustrations out was to continue on my circle journey, which I started. Let me see if I can give you a quick rundown before I carry on. I don't know. I like it. I see them hung individually in groups. So far I have 40 different ones, each individual, very abstract. All of it. The different circles. Feels good to make it. I don't know why. All of insanity. But when you're stuck at home, wondering what's going on, and all you have to do is watch TV, it's frustrating. Soon we'll know more. Yeah, or less. It's more. Look at that one. I like that one. The Republicans in Congress are refusing to wear their masks, and they're getting called out by Nadler and idiots. So yeah, I'm going to carry on. I have more ink. I have more time. No.
The committee will resume. Mrs. Cicilline.
So in your opening statement, you continue with your sustained effort to undermine the finding of Russian interference in our election. In 2019, you sent a letter to the committee mischaracterizing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's finding that Vladimir Putin interfered in the 2016 presidential election sweeping and systematic fashion to benefit Donald Trump. Mr. Mueller promptly sent you a letter calling you out for your mischaracterization, and you never corrected it. You then deleted the full report, leaving the American people stewing with your misleading summary in support of President Trump's bogus claims that there was no collusion, no obstruction. You repeat that there was no basis for this investigation, and it was politically motivated by calling it the Russiagate scandal. But of course, in December 2019, the Justice Department's Inspector General, your department's Michael Horowitz, found that the investigation had been initiated properly and without political bias. Isn't that correct?
No.
It's not correct. That was not Mr. Horowitz's finding?
No. He said
you are wrong, Mr. Attorney General. He's found the investigation had been initiated.
He said he found
reclaiming my time without political bias.
He said he
and
found
in April, reclaiming my time, Mr. Attorney. In April of this year, the Republican-led Intelligence Committee unanimously found that Russia interfered with our elections and attempted to undermine American democracy, correct? Is it ever appropriate, sir, for the president to solicit or accept foreign assistance in an election?
Depends what kind of assistance.
Is it ever appropriate for the president or presidential candidate to accept or solicit foreign assistance of any kind in his or her?
No, it's not appropriate.
Okay, I'm sorry you had to struggle with that one. God. Now let's turn to the First Amendment. Americans all across the and exercising their First Amendment rights to peacefully protest police brutality against Black people. I've read your statement, I listened to you this morning, and we're certainly aware of certain individuals with acts, and we all agree that's wrong. But there was a lot missing from your statement. For example, as I'm sure you've also seen, the vast majority of protesters are peaceful. Despite that, unidentified federal agents have attempted to prevent these mothers, veterans, and peaceful Americans from exercising their First Amendment rights, even using to grab protesters off the street and using tear gas and munitions against them. You forcefully condemned protesters this morning, but let me ask you, sir, why have you the federal officers you're sending into cities without proper training or attempting to take away the constitutional rights of Americans peacefully protesting?
I haven't condemned protesters. Protesters are good. Demonstrations are good. They're part of the First Amendment.
So let me ask
what I'm condemning is people who commit crime.
Yeah, do you think it's ever appropriate, Mr. Barr, for officers to use force against peaceful protesters? Yes or no?
Not against peaceful protesters.
So you also don't mention in today or your testimony that federal officers have even tear gassed elected representatives. County Commissioner Sharon Myron confirmed firsthand, last night I was tear gassed occupying force. I saw throw canisters of poison without warning into a nonviolent crowd, including elders and the vulnerable. And on July 20th, Ted Wheeler was tear gassed. He called the tactics of the officers abhorrent. These are elected representatives with grave concerns that officers are using abhorrent, including tear gassing elderly, nonviolent Americans. So let me ask you, sir, do you think it's ever appropriate to use tear gas on peaceful protesters?
The problem with these things sometimes occur because it's hard to separate people.
Mr. Barr, my question is very specific. Do you think it is ever appropriate to tear gas on peaceful protesters?
It is.
Yes or no?
It is appropriate to use tear gas when it's indicated to disperse
On peaceful
lawful assembly, and sometimes, unfortunately, peaceful protesters are affected.
Okay, now I'm going to show you there's video evidence as well. I'm going to ask you to look at this. Just so you know, that video is of Christopher David, a Navy veteran, being beaten and tear gassed by. Do you think that was appropriate?
Well, I didn't see him tear gas. There seems to be gas in the area. I don't know what kind of gas it was, and I don't know whether it was directed at him.
Do you think what happened to Mr. David was
Inspector-
appropriate, Mr.
The
Barr?
Inspector General's reviewing that.
Spray some
particular-
Well, do you think he deserved to get pepper sprayed and beaten to the point of bones?
As I say, the Inspector General is going to review the incident.
It's a question.
So as the top law enforcement official in our country, do you think Americans who show up to peacefully protest to be beaten and pepper sprayed and have their bones broken by federal officers?
Well, I don't think that what was happening immediately around the courthouse was a peaceful protest.
Not my question, Mr. Barr.
Well, that's where that.
My question is, do you think
That's
as
where
the
that-
chief,
that's where
reclaiming
the
my
video is
time,
from. That's where the
reclaiming my
video is
time,
from.
Mr. Barr, my question is, do you think the top law enforcement official in this country that Americans who show up to peacefully protest should expect to be beaten, pepper sprayed, and have their bones broken by federal officials? Yes or no?
Protesters should face that.
And that's correct. And isn't protecting the First Amendment freedom of Americans at least as important as protecting a building from vandalism? We fought for, I've not posed a question. We fought for a democracy, for the right to speak freely, and you are attempting to take that away. What's worse, you're doing it for the sole purpose of furthering the president's political agenda and generating footage for Trump campaign commercials. The Justice Department is responsible for protecting the constitutional rights of Americans, not to serve as the president's or political director. And speaking of protesters, it's worth remembering every suffragette, every person who marched to end child labor, every abolitionist who demanded an end to slavery, protester. The revolutionaries who transformed us from colonists into a nation were protesters. Protesters aren't chaos.
Thank
They're
you.
deeply American examples of values. Desire for this country to be at its best self. They're righteous, sometimes they're necessary. One of America's most beloved and effective protesters, John Lewis, lies in state of from here in a deserved place of honor. And sir, your failure to respect the role of peaceful protest in this country is a disgrace. It's un-American, and it's important to remember what these protests. Black Lives Matter, abused at the hands of police by Black Americans, and I want to let you see now a video that fairly represents peaceful protests all across America that you conveniently omitted from your testimony and your statement.
Dirty. Look at that. That's beautiful.
There was a 9-minute video shown by the other side, so it's not all mine, it's only part of it.
most hateful group of men in the Republican Party right now, and they need to be replaced with decent. The Republican Party is a decent party, just like the Democratic Party is. People are corrupt in there. We need to fix it. Yeah, that's really a terrible thing to paper sprayed. Of course, you're not going to play it, right? Hands up, please don't kill me. There's laughing. Wow. So
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, just real quick. I don't think we've ever had a hearing where the witness wasn't allowed to respond to points made, questions asked, and attacks every, not just in this hearing, not just in this committee, but every committee I've been on. So particularly when you think about the fact we got the Attorney General of the United States here. I don't want the time. I want the Attorney General to be able to have enough time to respond to accusations and questions asked him.
You don't
guys
have
not
the
cutting him off.
time.
You want is irrelevant, but irrelevant to the rules. Mr. Stubbe is recognized.
I love it.
Mr. Chairman, am I going to get an additional 2.5 minutes that this?
The gentleman is recognized.
General Barr, thank you for your service to our country and your continued service to ensure that our country. I encourage you to ignore the mob, these attacks from Democrats and the left-wing biased mainstream media. Be strong and courageous. For the mass country supports you and supports you rooting out corruption in the FBI and keeping our country safe from rioters, looters, and anarchists. I, for one, am very at the helm of the DOJ and actually supporting the rule of law and fighting for justice. I want to touch on something that Mr. Jordan spoke about in his opening remarks. I want Inspector General's December 9th FISA report on the FBI's unlawful surveillance of Trump campaign associate Carter Page. Isn't it true the Inspector General under the Obama-Biden administration made 17 significant errors in FISA applications to surveil candidate Trump's campaign associate Carter?
I think that's right.
How many errors are acceptable when the FBI is targeting Americans?
Well, none are acceptable.
Then there was the complete Woods Files failures the FBI operated under during the Obama and Biden administration. The Inspector General found that one, factual assertions in the FISA applications to surveil Page, one, lacked supporting documentation, two, the supporting document did not support factual assertions, or three, the supporting document showed the FBI's factual assertion was inaccurate. The Inspector General testified there should not have even been one error, or 51 errors. Why is it so important for surveillance targeting Americans to be error-free?
Well, especially under FISA, which is a counterintelligence tool and doesn't have the same built-in protections that the criminal justice process would have. It's very important. You're going to be spying on Americans that you haven't, you've demonstrated an appropriate basis for doing that, and there's special burden on the investigative agency, in this case the FBI, to have accurate information as to the basis of their surveillance. And I think the Bureau has been working very hard to correct those problems and to put in place
They
a
just
much
let him waste
more
rambling.
effective system of
Has nothing to
guaranteeing
do
that
with
the
why
information is accurate.
We're just talking about old stuff.
Isn't it true that FBI under the Obama-Biden administration favorable evidence to obtain a FISA warrant
Take
to surveil
Obama
Carter
to
Page
court.
and
How
ignore
about that?
facts that
Oh,
cut against
dang.
probable cause?
Well, I don't want to characterize part of what's under review. Some exculpatory information was not passed along to the court. That's evident in the Inspector General's report.
I will yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Jordan.
Nah, nothing to say.
The gentleman for yielding. Mr. Attorney General, do you deploy federal law enforcement to enforce federal law?
Jim Jordan
Yeah.
covered
Do you deploy federal law enforcement federal property?
160
Would the federal building in Portland be standing today if you had not deployed
in a
federal law
wrestling?
enforcement?
I don't think
No.
so. Multiple attempts to set it afire.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I don't understand why a small contingent of marshals inside the court goes to anybody's First Amendment rights. They set up a fence on federal property, I've been told, around the court, and when people are arrested, it's because they're into the fence. These aren't peaceful protesters. They bring power tools to cut through the wire and so forth to get in. This is a very strange occupation of a city.
Yeah.
Have 100, 120 federal people behind the fence trying to protect the building, and all these people are trying to cut their way in. That occupation of a city.
Thank you.
Where are those?
Did the
people
Chicago
that-
Fraternal Order of
Arrest them.
Police chief or president ask for your help?
Who asked for my help?
The head of the FOP in Chicago, did they ask for your help?
I think it did. I think it did.
Previous exchange, we talked about Mr. Horowitz's report. Is there anything you'd like to add? You didn't get a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, my recollection of the report is it didn't find there was no bias. And he made that clear in subsequent testimony. What he find no documentary or other evidence.
Couldn't you find
demonstrating-
no double negative?
Yeah, it would be helpful. Maybe Mr. Horowitz could come in front of this committee and raising that concern with you, Mr. Attorney General, could ask Mr. Horowitz himself about what you found in that report and subsequent reports that we have not yet had a hearing on.
The gentleman's time is asking. Thank you.
Sure. Did I hear you correctly to say that the purpose of unleashing this federal agent assault with tear gas and rubber spray on 2,000 nonviolent protesters in Lafayette Square was to secure and defend the St. John's Episcopal Church? Is that the purpose of it?
No, I make very clear that the purpose was to move the perimeter to High Street, which had been, as far as I'm aware, all day before.
It was legitimate in that
I'm
case.
talking about the June 1st.
Yeah, the June 1st assault on a lot of people, including my constituents, and
Well,
I
wasn't it?
bring them to your.
I don't think it was an assault. They were told by loudspeaker that the park police were preparing to clear H Street, and could they move off H Street?
Reclaiming my time. I think the St. John's Episcopal Church would have been open.
No, that was on Sunday. On Sunday night, I believe. I
Okay.
hope I-
Are you aware that the rector of the church, that the Episcopal Archbishop and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church nationally, along with the Catholic Bishop of the Archdiocese of Washington, all denounced this police assault on civil liberties of the people?
Did they do that before or after the fire was put out?
Well, all that I know is that they denounced what you did. If you read what the Archbishop, the Episcopal Archbishop of Washington wrote, said that using police force to clear protesters without notice in order to conduct this grotesque photo opportunity was antithetical to the principles of Christianity. What I want to ask you about was COVID-19, because we now lead the world in COVID-19 case count and death count. President Trump, of course, promised that this would quickly disappear. He advertised quack medical cures like injecting people with disinfectant. He told his people to slow down all the testing and refuse for months. Last night, he retweeted a number of messages claiming that Dr. Fauci misled the American people by dismissing hydroxychloroquine for the disease. So now we have 150,000 dead Americans, 4 million infected, 40 million jobless. We lose more than 1,000 people every day, one American every 90 seconds. But you called public health leadership superb, and you threw the weight of the justice behind his campaign to shut down state public health orders in March and April. Now, if you look at the screen, you will see two tweets from the United States: liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia. On April 17th, He retweeted the slogans of right-wing protesters, access to hospitals, and trying to overthrow public health orders in those states. And you snapped to attention on April 27th. You designated a prosecutor to bring down those very public health orders in Michigan and Virginia. 2 days later, armed right-wing protesters and white supremacists dismantled the Michigan legislature, leveling death threats against Governor Whitmer, confronting police, taunting lawmakers, and forcing the legislature to shut down as they had long guns and shouted in the faces of police officers. But you didn't send in a secret paramilitary police force on horseback to unleash tear gas, billy clubs, and rubber bullets against these protesters storming the state capital, Michigan. No, you embraced their cause by joining litigation against the governors of Michigan and Virginia. Now, of course, your side lost your motions for emergency injunction, but you got to spread Trump's message. It was time to call off the stay-at-home orders, the masking, and social distancing. Here's what you said on national TV, echoing the claim in April that the cure was disease. Quote, you can't just keep on feeding the patient chemotherapy and say, well, we're killing the cancer, because we were getting to the point, the patient. Do you remember saying that?
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Exactly what it says. You have to balance the cure with the danger, which we leave to go. You know, I know everyone likes. I know everyone likes to lay everything at the feet of the president, but this is a federal republic, and the president respected that. And our response has been largely run by governors. Now, for someone who claims to be so concerned about executive overreach, I haven't heard anyone keeping an eye on what the governor's doing.
Mr. Burr, with no
And that's
vaccine,
all the Department of
excuse me,
Justice is
time,
doing,
fine. No
in the
vaccine,
area of religious liberty.
with no, this protected your position on religious liberty 5 and said there was nothing wrong with applying public health orders to churches.
That was on an injunction.
Did you accept that, or you don't accept it? Well, then we'll talk about it later. Mr. Barr, with no vaccine, no treatment, no cure in sight, you worked to disarm the states of the only weapon we have, disease, public health measures. And now we pay the price of this policy in overrun intensive care units and wards, a shortage of coffins and refrigerators, and an out-of-control pandemic, which makes us a global pariah state whose citizens cannot enter dozens of foreign countries, including Canada. Dr. Fauci was saying at the same time that you were moving to take down those public health orders. Here's what Dr. Fauci was warning us about 3 months ago about the of health orders. If only you would listen. He said, I feel if that occurs, there is a real risk you will trigger an outbreak and you may not be able to control it, which in fact,
Taking down public health orders, we were making narrow. We were calling attention to the guy.
will you restore my time because this witness is speaking over my time?
You were over here.
Respond.
He's trying to. Gentleman's time is expired.
Mr. Chairman. Gentleman's recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have a governor engaged in overreach, particularly regarding the civil rights of Virginians and their expression of their religious faith. So I want to give the Attorney General the opportunity to respond to the gentleman from Maryland.
We adopted a very narrow approach of calling to the attention, usually by letter, not by lawsuit, situations where they were treating religion worse than they were other kinds of organizations and gatherings, and the Constitution requires it the same. And we were calling those to the attention of the governors, and most of the governors that we called attention to voluntarily changed their own orders. There are a few pointed out anomalies in the regulation, differential regulation of business. And again, mostly they were voluntarily changed by the governors.
Yeah,
So not a wholesale attack on
Like
stay-at-home
twisting it
orders. It was
elbow.
just that these are very broad powers that have been ceded. You know, basically telling everyone to stay at home and only work if you're in a business and so forth. And therefore, someone has to keep an eye on that and make sure there's no overreach. And as time went by, there were times where that you had rules in effect that were overly burdensome and raised constitutional problems.
I want to thank you for raising those points early, and in particular to Virginia and the church out on the Eastern Shore. I want to thank you also for being here and for returning to lead the Department of Justice and root out the rank partisanship and bias that had corrupted
It's
the
Ben
administration of
Klein of
justice for many
Virginia.
years. The Democrats alleged that attorneys politicized the Justice Department doing the personal bidding of President Trump, but it's not only unfounded, it's especially hypocritical in light of the politicization that occurred during the Obama-Biden administration and led by President Obama's self-described wingman, Attorney General Eric Holder. The Justice Department investigated journalists, shut out career prosecutors, and flouted congressional oversight. I want to ask, particularly, even after President Trump assumed office, FBI lawyers exhibited bias against Trump while working for both Mueller and the FBI's Russia investigation. The Inspector General couldn't rule out political animus against candidate Trump as influencing FBI views, correct?
That's my understanding.
Inspector General found that an FBI lawyer altered evidence to support a FICE application to surveil Carter Page
Nothing to do
and
with what's going on
criminally
today.
referred this
No,
lawyer to Durham
nothing.
federal. The same lawyer who
Mock
also worked on the
court.
investigations into Clinton's
Yes, they
misuse
had
of classified
Obama
information and Russia collusion
here.
expressed
And so
bias
what we're
against
listening to is
President Trump
nothing to do
and the
with
five
problems
back in
going
December
on
that
in
can't rule out
America
bias.
today.
Mr. Attorney General,
Which is
asked
why
what would
we
the
are
consequences
there.
be
So
when
I
the
can
Justice
talk over
Department
him
lawyers
the
if they
entire
document
time,
underlying
letting you know
documents so they can
that
support
he is talking
minutes of
about
federal
old
court.
shit.
In the abstract, or in
And
general.
Barr knows
the-
nothing,
that
ever.
would be
He
fine.
thinks.
Would they likely be disqualified? And isn't it true that the IG found that an FBI lawyer doctored an email to support probable cause against candidate Trump's campaign aide? And the same FBI lawyer worked on the Russia investigation targeting
America's gonna have
candidate Trump's campaign and was on the special counsel Mueller team, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
He's not
And
sure.
while working on those investigations, the Inspector
No,
General
no.
found several texts showing that
On that particular lawyer, I believe so.
yes.
He
I
knows
can't
that.
remember the time frame of the text. There were other texts.
I'm going to talk to you about the unmasking that occurred where Mr. Grinnell released a list of 39 who submitted a request to unmask the identity of General Flynn from November 8th, 2016 to January 31st, 2017. 49 were submitted. Is that a normal number of requests for unmasking?
I mean, historically, that seems to be a high number. And the other question you have to ask, why was this after the election?
And 7 Treasury officials,
Let's find
including
out.
Secretary
Please,
of the
let's
Treasury
find
Jacob
out.
Lew, Deputy Secretary Sarah.
Please,
Is that a normal
open
occurrence?
it all up.
There are times where
More
high-level
redactions.
officials can do it. I don't know enough about this.
Yield the remainder of my time, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Attorney General, what's more important, going to church or going to a
Tag team.
protest?
It depends on the individual.
Both, right? Yeah, what's more important, going to work or going to a protest?
Oh,
Uh,
what?
Again, it depends on the individual. We're all free. We all
Yeah.
make choices.
I'm talking about government limits on those activities. What's more important, government putting limits on protesting or government putting limit on attending church?
You can't limit
Or they're both-
protest.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. We should treat them the same, shouldn't we?
Gentleman's time is expired, Mr.
Well,
Grandpa.
then get to church. Bye.
Mr.
Well,
June
we get
1st,
mandates.
there were protests against the murder of George Floyd and police brutality in Lafayette Park. Let us not be distracted by you or your colleagues as to what these powerful and massive protests were actually about. They were about the persistent killing
from
of black bodies, law
Washington,
enforcement, and
7th District.
finally, an awakening in America of the conscience of our country. And yet your response to direct federal officers to close in on the protesters and to use shields offensively as weapons, tear gas, pepper bullets, explosive devices, batons, and horses to clear the area just so the president could get a photo op. So I do want to ask, do you think that your response, do you think the response at Lafayette Square to tear gas, pepper spray, and beat protesters and injure Americans who were just simply exercising their First Amendment rights was appropriate?
Well, first, it's my understanding that no tear gas was used.
Mr. Barr, that is a semantic distinction that has been proven false by many fact checkers.
How is it
Do you
semantic?
think
How is it semantic? Tear gas is a particular.
about chemical irritants and
Yes.
it has been proven false by
Fauci.
reports? So just answer the question. Do you think that
I think
it's
peppers-
appropriate at Lafayette to pepper spray, tear gas, and beat protesters and injure American citizens?
Well, I don't accept your characterization of what happened, but the effort there was.
Mr. Barr, I
The
just
effort
asked
there
for a
was
yes
to-
or no, so let me just tell you, I'm starting to lose my temper. According to sworn testimony before Natural Resources Committee by Army National Guard Officer Adam DeMarco, who was there, this was, quote, an unprovoked escalation of use of force against peaceful protesters.
Well, I don't
Numerous
remember, I don't
media
remember
reports have
DeMarco as
confirmed-
being, I don't
Mr.
remember
Barr,
DeMarco
excuse
as being
me, this
involved
is
in
my
the
time.
decision making.
Sir, the president told governors on a telephone call that the way to deal with the protesters of police brutality and systemic racism like in Lafayette School is that, quote, you have to get much tougher. You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. These are terrorists. I talked about you on that call, sir. Here's what he said. He said, the Attorney General is here, Bill Barr, and we will activate Bill Barr and activate. Do you remember that call, Mr. Barr?
Yes, I did, but he wasn't talking about protesters, he was talking
Mr.
about
Barr,
rioting.
apparently the president believes that you can be to implement the president's agenda and dominate American people exercising First Amendment rights if they're protesting against him. But let's respond when the protesters are supporters of the president. On two separate occasions, after President Trump liberate Michigan to subvert stay-home orders to protect the public health of people in Michigan, protesters swarmed the Michigan carrying guns, some with swastikas, Confederate flags, and one even with a dark-haired doll with a noose around its neck. Are you aware that these protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded?
No,
You're not aware of that.
I was not aware.
Major protest in
You're looking
Michigan,
at
the
nothing.
attorney general, and you didn't know that the protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded.
Wow.
So obviously you couldn't be concerned.
There were a lot of
You
protests
did-
around the United States, and on June
Attorney
1st,
General
I
Barr,
was
you
worried
seem
about
to
the
be
District of
engaging
Columbia,
in
which is
protests
federal.
in certain parts of the country. Be aware of those, but when protesters with guns and
I'm very,
swastikas and
I am
Confederate
aware of
flag, excuse me,
protesters
Mr.
in
Barr, this
federal
is my
government.
time and I control. You are aware of certain kinds of protesters, but in Michigan, when protesters carry guns and Confederate flags and swastikas and call for the governor to be beheaded and shot and lynched, somehow you're not aware of that. Somehow you didn't know about it, so you didn't send federal agents in and supporters what you did to the president's protesters. In fact, you didn't put pepper balls on those protesters. So the point I'm trying to make that I think is very important for the country to understand is that there is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's done. But when Black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are terrorists by the president. You take an aggressive approach to Black Lives Matter protests, but not to right-wing extremists threatening to lynch a governor. It's for the if it's for the president's benefit. Don't get it right, Mr. Barr.
I have responsibility for the federal government, and the White House is the seat.
Barr, let me
Grant.
just make it clear, you
Not-
are supposed
the
to
Michigan
represent
authorities
the
can
people
handle-
of the United
Michigan
States
authorities
of
can
America,
handle-
not violate people's First Amendment rights. supposed to uphold democracy and secure equal justice under the law, not violently dismantle certain protesters based on the president's personal.
Lady's time is expired.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to also introduce into the record a report from the MIT Election Data Lab, which says that over the past 20 years, more than 250 million ballots have been cast by mail, and the fraud rate is 0.0006%.
Without objection, Mr. Eschenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, AG Barr, for being here today. And I'm sincere when I say it's an honor. AG Barr, let me just
Could I just ask you for 1 minute, though?
to respond. Yes.
Yeah. As I made clear, moving H Street out to I Street as the perimeter was a decision made the day it was justified by the extreme rioting that was going on around the White House. I don't remember Captain DeMarco, who ran as a Democratic candidate for Congress in Maryland, even being close to the discussions as to what was going on. Now, fact is that the movement was not geared to the behavior of that particular crowd. It was geared to the fact that we were moving the perimeter fence up on H Street, by H Street. But it is a fact that the Park Police reported, and I saw myself barrels being thrown from that crowd. So I did not consider them all peaceful protesters. I'm sorry. Thank you for giving me an opportunity.
AG Barr. AG Barr, I'd like to also talk about the violent protests that are being seen in Seattle, specifically Chaz, and also Portland, Oregon. Over the course of June and early July, several shootings occurred inside Seattle's police-free zone, including the tragic murders of a 16-year-old. There were numerous reports of robberies, assaults, and property destruction as well.
Sexual assaults as well.
Yeah. All this chaos, all this violence, it took the Seattle mayor literally weeks to declare this an unlawful gathering, and police were allowed to clear that area. In similar circumstances, let's talk about Portland, Oregon. It's been going through 8 weeks of violent rioting in the streets as well. Rioters continue, in fact, to fire projectiles and mortar-style fireworks at federal law enforcement officers that are using dangerous lasers permanently blinded at least 3 federal officers. Yet our own Chairman Jerry Nadler, told a reporter on Sunday that the anarchy and violence, and I quote the chairman, is a myth that is spread only in Washington, D.C., end quote. Attorney General Barr, is it in fact an anarchy and anarchist groups engaging in violence in Portland?
I think there are anarchist and far left groups that are violence in Portland. I actually think that the chairman's comment was about Antifa. I'm not sure exactly what he said, but I thought he was referring to Antifa.
Or do you think it's a myth and it's
you saw that
involved
there,
in this
huh?
anarchy?
No, I think Antifa is involved in Portland.
So either way, the chairman's comments were not correct, were not accurate.
I didn't consider them.
What about the autonomous zone in Seattle? Swim Jayapal has said, and I quote, that it's a peaceful protest zone. Is it a peaceful protest zone?
No, as I already said, it's outrageous. You know, people set themselves up and over a piece of territory where the people in there have not selected them as the government and try to exercise outrage. And you know, we saw people handing out guns to people to quote, keep the peace and so forth. It was
Your office has already charged several violent protesters with federal crimes. Can you just briefly elaborate on those crimes?
the whole gamut. I think we've had 224. They run the gamut from throwing Molotov cocktails to you know, assaulting a police officer, that kind of thing.
Thank you. I say that I think, and I don't know if you agree, that Chaz and Portland are really like political experiments. They really show us what would happen if we fully embrace the radical ideology of the social justice Democrats. You know, according to Democrats, it's the summer of love. According to the Congress that represents Seattle, it's a peaceful protest zone. Attorney General Barr, in reality, these cities are experiencing violence, chaos, and frankly, just anarchy. This political experiment has showed us that the liberal, social justice, Democrat style government has failed. Would you like to comment on that, Attorney General Barr?
Well, when I was first going through confirmation, I expressed concern about violence getting into our political system. We've seen some attacking people, and I was very worried about that. And how we've seen it
How's the
sweeping through
investigation
the country
going on
like
the
this. And I hope the Democratic Party
federal
the
judge's
violence.
son?
Thank you, I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back, Ms. Deming.
From the FedEx office.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barr. You're over here.
I'm sorry.
You're in the corner. Earlier during your testimony, you talked about gun violence, and you asked, what about those lives? And yes, Mr. Barr,
of Florida,
those lives do
Democrat.
matter. But do you believe that police officers should be held or held to your standard?
Yes, and you know, someone mentioned my comment about we shouldn't permit resistance. We shouldn't take that as a matter of course. But I never suggest that just because someone resists, that justifies whatever's done. By no means.
Thank you so
By no
much for
means
that,
it
because good police officers also believe that they are held to standards. So I'm glad to hear you say that. As a former police detective, I've saw many cases based on patterns of behavior, and there is an alarming pattern I believe developing. It appears, Mr. Barr, every time a U.S. attorney investigates the president or those close to him, he or she is removed and replaced by friends. You have removed U.S. attorneys in the Eastern District of New York, the District of Columbia, and the Eastern District of Texas. On June 19th, Mr. Berman would be stepping down. And let me just be clear, when you told America that Mr. Berman was stepping down, did Mr. Berman tell you stepping down?
No.
No.
But stepping down is the language that I'm told.
Okay, he did not tell you that.
No.
Okay.
But it's the language used to leave flexibility as to whether the person is doing it
On
the line.
June 20th, when asked about the basis for Mr. Berman's removal, you announced he was being fired, stepping down. The president's personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, suggested that, and I quote, the reason may lie in the fact that Berman was involved in what Giuliani described as baseless investigations. Sir, if that wasn't true, if you didn't remove Mr. Berman because in investigations of the president and those close to him, why would the president's personal attorney think that?
I'm sorry, what did he say and when? I didn't hear the quote.
Mr. Giuliani suggests that
When?
June 20th, that he may have been fired because he was in baseless investigations.
Well, if he said that, that's nonsense. Number one, anyone familiar with the Department of Justice would say that the component head is not going to have any effect on any pending investigation.
Okay, and I know you're aware of reports that Berman's office was in fact investigated. The president's attorney, Mr. Cohen, his current personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, his current personal attorney's associates, and his presidential inaugural. Mr. Barr.
I don't mean to suggest just by my silence that I'm confirming that. That seems to be your opinion.
Okay, all right. Have you in any way to influence or interfere with any investigation in the Southern District, including the investigations I just mentioned?
I've not interfered in any investigation. I've written on occasion about certain matters, but as far as I'm aware, the office with the resolution.
Your efforts to remove him bypass the normal operation of law. Now we know the OLC opinion indicates that the president cannot be indicted or criminally prosecuted.
Jail, Bill Barr.
Because you made sure President Trump understood that in your 19-page or however job application. However, you are aware the special counsel confirmed that a sitting president can be investigated. You did read that in the special counsel. Is that correct?
Yes.
Given Mr. Trump's residence and former business location, the Southern District Bourbon's office would have decision authority over whether to investigate the president himself. And you removed him.
I've explained why I removed.
Okay, so under penalty of perjury, do you still maintain, as you stated in a February 13th interview, that the president has never asked you to do anything? Case, yes or no, please?
Yeah, no, I mean, will I confirm it? Is that the
No.
question?
Do you stand by your testimony?
Never asked me, directed me, pressured me to do anything in the criminal case.
Okay, all right. You are aware, and I think you had this conversation earlier with colleagues, that the president's former attorney, Mr. Cohen, was released early from prison due to concerns of COVID-19.
Yes.
Okay, and court the decision to send Mr. Cohen back to prison.
I didn't even know the decision was made.
Did you support it based after you?
Well, I haven't looked into it, and my understanding of why it happened was
Mr. Barr, as a former.
The gentleman is trying to explain.
The president has made a mockery of justice, and I believe as the nation's top cop, no one should care more about that
Right.
than you.
you're a prison.
Mr. Armstrong, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 10 years ago this summer in July, in my
Now,
hometown, it
protect
was a beautiful day.
No
We were
comment.
golfing, kids were swimming, everybody. Baseball, just a perfect, gorgeous, sunny summer day in Dickinson, North Dakota. And in the span of 8 minutes, a tornado came through and destroyed, caused unbelievable devastation.
We're not going to talk
I
about
don't think anybody
police.
woke up the next morning and said it was a mostly peaceful day. And I want us to talk specifically about what's going on in Portland with you, Mr. Attorney General. 61 nights the federal courthouse is under siege, but not just the courthouse. Federal agents are under siege. You have men and women there protecting that courthouse. If they were there, that courthouse would not be standing right now. Would you agree with that? Absolutely. And I think one of our problems is how we talk about this and how it's covered versus what's actually going every single night in
That is
Portland
farmers
at that
bailout money.
courthouse. Can you explain what your officers and your agents are going through over there?
On the holiday.
Yes. About the U.S. Marshals who were in the courthouse. They have initially tried to contain themselves in the courthouse. There have been efforts to push through in the main door. When people have succeeded in breaching the courthouse, they've thrown kerosene and fireworks and started fires. So then the effort was to make sure that breach. There still have been breaches into the courthouse. But basically, they try to remain in there. And starting after the tried to arrest the people who were directing fireworks. They would climb up onto the side of the court, break windows, shoot fireworks, and whenever they came out to try to put an end to that, or interdict it, they were shot at with slingshots, lasers being put into their eyes even when they're inside the courthouse. There's a good description of it in an AP story.
I was just going to quote that. We don't have to take your word. I watched as officers were hauled inside. In one case, the commercial firework came over so fast the officer didn't have time to respond. It burned through his sleeve, and he had on both forearms. Another had a concussion from being hit in the head with a mortar.
Right. That's right. And, we've had a lot of injuries. And, these are people who this Congress has charged with protecting federal courts. They're directed to protect the U.S. code, and they are under attack. And they're being injured, and it's been constant for 60 days.
Acting Secretary Wolf has said that the violation of personal information of federal officers, jeopardizing not only them, but their families. Why is doxing federal agents so dangerous, and are you concerned about it?
It's dangerous because people can take retaliation against their homes, their families, or
Bullshit.
or them when they're by themselves. I see some of these Latin American countries in Central America where the police are very, very brave because the gangs they're trying to deal with go to their houses and kill their families. And
Oh my God.
I could never think that could happen here, but you could never think some of the stuff
Every single
could
day.
ever happen here.
Is being burned by essentially improvised explosive device, being blinded by lasers, is this something that typically
federal marshals in federal courthouses?
No, not at all.
How is this handled? How is this going for recruitment, morale? How are they doing? I generally, how are they doing?
They're loving.
Well, I think that AP
high
story,
fiving each other in the streets as they
gives you a
blind
feel.
people.
They feel that's their duty and they
Their
feel
feet
that's where they have to be in that area.
It's a video.
But they're extremely tired, and we've had to rotate in some more, we'll put in some more
laying
people
around.
because they're very, very tired. You make mistakes.
Well, and I think that's an important part because I think one of the most amazing parts of this whole thing, it started with under 30 agents there. Now it's still under 100. 61 defend against
There is not under
fires,
100 now.
burning down these things. You know what's the most amazing thing? They get up every morning and that courthouse is still running. They're still conducting the federal government's business. I'm going to say something that I think should be said a lot more often. Tell them thank you. Tell the courthouse personnel thank you. Tell the courts thank you. Tell the prosecutors. Tell the judges thank you. And if you can handle it, can you tell the public defenders thank you too? Because they're still conducting the business. They do this every single night. Are they getting sleep?
The marshals are having a difficult time because the demonstrators go to the hotel. They also go from hotel to hotel because the demonstrators disrupt their sleep at the hotel.
And there's a difference between a protest and a riot. Every night at some point in time in Portland, it turns into a riot. Eventually, when you wake up the next morning, it's going to happen again, then we need to figure out a way to stop it.
Yeah.
And then just one last question. Why would we have to negotiate a ceasefire with a peaceful protest?
Correct. But why would, that's right. Well, we don't want, what we would like to see, and all we would like, is what we see in the country, which is state and local law enforcement taking care of their own city and taking care of the streets around the courthouse.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Barr, welcome. Let's talk a little bit about the census. You know, that's the process where every 10 years we decide how many congressional seats each state gets, how much funding for schools, healthcare, other issues region gets. Let's talk about the president's memo directing the Commerce Secretary to exclude undocumented immigrants from the count of the 2020 census count. Mr. Barr, President is essentially saying something, trying to get something constitutional and illegal. 14th Amendment, and I quote, representatives shall be apportioned among several states according to their numbers, counting whole numbers of person in each state. And then federal law, as you know, 2 USC subsection, and I quote, the president shall transmit to the Congress a statement showing the whole number of persons in each state. Can I read that more or less?
Yes.
Do you agree that the president's memo essentially violates the Constitution?
No.
Are undocumented people not full individuals?
They're not what?
Are undocumented individuals in this country full people?
They are obviously people, but the legal issue there was the terminology of the Constitution.
Well, if I may,
it reflects the decision in the Constitution that they count inhabitants.
My time, sir. Just you used to work for the Department of Justice back in 1989. There was a letter written to Senator by the DOJ on point. If there's a slide, there's a letter, and I would ask unanimous consent to admit that to the record. And I quote, in the past, the Department of Justice has taken the position that Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, that the original apportionment and census of Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, requires that inhabitants of states who are illegal aliens be included in the census. And in our view, this issue today, we have found no basis for reversing that position. Are you reversing that position now?
What the department advised is that This came up because Alabama claims you cannot count illegal aliens in the census Constitution. The department looked at it and advised that Congress can determine the meaning of inhabitant for this purpose, that it is not a self-defining term as they
Only got 2 minutes, sir.
that they recognize.
Mr. Barr, if I
Yeah,
may.
but this is a hearing. I thought I was the one that was supposed to be heard.
Well, let me get there. The current dispute, you talked back when the Supreme Court struck down the president's attempt to question on the census. At that time, the president announced an executive order to collect citizenship information by other means. And at that time, made reference to a current dispute over whether illegal aliens can be included in the apportionment purposes. Is that what you're referring to now, sir?
I think that I could have been referring to the Alabama case.
So
I can't remember.
is the DOJ studying this issue? Have you concluded?
Yes.
Can you provide this committee with any research, any concluding memos on that issue?
I'll look into it. But we have considered it, and as I said, our advice is and that Congress does have the power to define the term inhabitant to either include or exclude.
But we're talking about the president's executive.
Well, Congress has delegated that power to the Commerce Secretary. So as the law stands now, we think the Commerce Secretary has the delegate of congressional power to define that term. That's a reasonable argument to make.
Attorney General, in the last few seconds I have. President within the law. Nobody is above the law in this country, including the President of the United States. My concern is he goes around doing tweets, dictums that are clearly unconstitutional. My district, sir, is a working class, hard working community, immigrant, the greatest generation. All we want is equity based on the census. We want to make sure we get our federal dollars like everybody else around the country, that our representation is equal, individual, in Orange County as it is in other parts of the country. All we ask for is respect, sir. I ask you, please tell the president, stop tweeting things, stop writing memos that are clearly unconstitutional. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back, Ms. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General Barr, will you send a thank you to the law enforcement people that work for you for the work that they're doing here across the United States of America? Thank all the law enforcement across our country. We're an imperfect country, but law enforcement has done they do a good job across our country, and nice for that. I'm going to ask you a question about Mr. Burnell Trammell from Milwaukee here in just a minute. He was the man shot to death at the end of last week. He's the African-American man who was wearing a sign he's regularly known around for carrying a Trump for President sign. But I want to share with you what happened in Madison, Wisconsin, so we all understand that this is a myth about Antifa. So when the riots hit Minneapolis and then extended around the country, they hit Madison, Wisconsin also. And I don't know if you've ever visited Madison, Wisconsin. There's an iconic street there called State Street. It starts at the Capitol and runs all the way down to the University of Wisconsin. And that street, if you go there now, 75 businesses are boarded up as a result of a mayor and city council who would not protect those people. Those people went to the city council last week and they asked for some assistance. The city council, who would not protect their business, they said, no, we're not going to provide you for assistance. Shortly after State Street was destroyed. By the way, it's this the film that I've seen that the police cruiser that went flaming down State Street was not in. But shortly after that, about a week afterwards, two monuments at the state capitol that I used to walk by all the time were torn down. Of Hans Christian Heg, who was the abolitionist Norwegian immigrant who died at Chickamauga defending the Union. and providing for the end of slavery, fighting for the end of slavery here in the United States. The other monument that was torn down, by the way, they tore it down, was Lady Forward. Lady Forward is there because of women's suffrage. Wisconsin was the first state to pass suffrage back in the early 1900s here in the United States of America. Those were torn down. Just yesterday, a social worker who teaches at a local school just outside Madison in Mount Horeb, she was meeting a state senator, a Democrat state senator. Her name is Samantha Hamer. Hopefully she will be given justice. But I want to emphasize colleagues on the left that if you think you're insulated from Antifa, which is supposedly a myth, you should really think them and other radicals, they will not spare violence on anyone. Their anarchy is meant to destroy our country. And I would ask you to, if you want a former colleague of mine, State Senator Tim Carpenter, Democrat, he'll tell you he was beat to a pulp on that night when they were tearing down those statues. It is not a myth. So, Mr. Attorney General, yes, Mr. Burnell Trammell, I don't know if our Attorney General Paul in Wisconsin, or the mayor of Milwaukee, Sue, what appears to perhaps be a political execution. Are you familiar with that situation in Milwaukee?
In the shooting of that, I've read about it.
If the Attorney General and other law enforcement in Wisconsin do not act, will the federal government study the situation and bring justice for Mr. Trammell and his family?
Yes, we'll certainly study that.
This is not a myth. You're hearing it from all over the country, and we're hearing it all the time in Portland and Seattle. This happened in Madison, Wisconsin also, where a mayor, a far leftist mayor, proudly sat on a street, actually not a street, a highway with protesters, and shut down traffic. And then State Street, most iconic streets in the state of Wisconsin and in Madison, was destroyed. And I'm not so sure that those businesses are going to get businesses back. It is not a myth, folks. What's happening is real across our country, and we need to stop. These are not peaceful protests. These are riots that are happening, and we need to call an end to it. And I hope you, Attorney General, will work towards that end.
It's got your back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon.
Attorney General Barr, I wanted to follow up on some questions from one of my colleagues. You testified earlier that you have at times voted by mail. Is that correct?
Yes.
I once voted by mail.
So if public records show you voted by mail in 2012 and 2019, do you agree with that?
I think I can't really remember the details.
Okay.
I think on one occasion I had to go to a station and
Okay.
vote
But you did it
before the
twice,
election.
vote
I
by
think in
mail.
another one I
I'm
voted
claiming
by
my
mail.
time,
Think,
sir.
think.
Yeah.
I raised this because in May, 800 public health experts from across the nation sent a letter urging Congress to prepare for a presidential election by mail to allow Americans from home and assure their health and
Gay
safety. You're aware that health
scam,
experts
Democrat,
have emphasized that voting by
Pennsylvania,
mail is
Mary
critical
Gay
to protect
scam.
public health in this upcoming election, correct? In May of this year. If you're not aware of it, I can provide this to you.
I'd be interested in
Your
seeing.
staff,
Yeah.
great. Extra copy for you. So that public health advice is important to citizens in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because we have a large population of seniors who are at higher risk for the coronavirus. They shouldn't have to choose between risking their lives and exercising their right to vote. But the problem we're facing is that the president has repeatedly sought to cast doubt on the security of mail-in ballots, saying that the 2020 election could be rigged with, quote, millions of mail-in ballots printed by foreign countries, end quote.
Oh my
Sir,
God.
This disinformation.
Well, it's not
Barr,
just information.
I don't have a question for you yet. Here it comes. Last month, you echoed the president's conspiracy theory when he suggested in at least 3 interviews that, quote, foreign countries could manufacture counterfeit ballots, end quote, to influence the presidential election, correct? You did that in at least 2 interviews?
Yes.
Okay. But in fact, you have no evidence that foreign countries can successfully sway our elections with counterfeit ballots?
But I have common
Okay,
sense.
Okay, well, and that's what you responded when you were directly challenged on that. You said, no, you didn't have evidence, but it was obvious. According to state election officials, your alleged concerns here are not obvious, but in fact are outrageous.
And false.
Every state in the union has ballots. 2/3 of the states allow for vote by mail for any reason. 5 states, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, vote entirely by mail and have done so for decades. Even the U.S. military uses mail-in ballots.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that after you suggested without evidence that foreign adversaries could sway our elections using counterfeit ballots, election experts and officials from around the country said that what you suggested was virtually impossible, preposterous, would never happen, and would be readily detected due to the multiple levels of security in ballot systems?
There are not multiple levels of security.
Okay, well, so.
And I don't agree, I
Reclaim-
don't agree that it's a.
Okay, reclaiming my, I'm happy to supply you with the statements that were
Before
provided
Donald
from around
Trump
the
raised
country.
concerns about it,
In
every
fact,
major publication.
Reclaiming my time. In fact, there is no evidence that foreign countries can make counterfeit ballots and create a real threat to our election security. Are you aware that in May, the president tweeted, and I quote, mail-in voting will lead to massive fraud and abuse. It will also lead to the end of our great party, end quote.
I was unaware of that.
No,
I don't suggest, sir, that the president is spreading disinformation about mail-in ballots because he's afraid that he and his party will lose. The fact, Mr. Barr, is that our foreign adversaries cannot actually influence our elections by submitting massive counterfeit ballots, but the FBI and our intelligence services have repeatedly warned that those adversaries are actively so mistrust of our election systems, and by repeating disinformation about mail-in voting, you and the president are helping them. Just switching gears, you would agree.
Well,
You
maybe
would
to
agree
respond to
that
that.
prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with the political party, wouldn't you?
Who makes
You said in 2017 that prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with the political party,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
And in fact, you and your wife have $730,000 to Republican and conservative candidates, including donations of $58,000 to Republican senators and Senate 4 months preceding your confirmation. Ooh. That's correct,
Are you
isn't it?
surprised I'm a Republican?
Is that correct that you made those donations,
Over time.
including just before?
That's a cumulative of a long period of time, but basically, I
Mr.
never
Chair,
hid the
I
fact
yield
I'm a
back,
Republican.
and
I was
would
talking about
also-
career leaders have generally historically avoided making contributions. That's my view.
$30,000 is not.
Time of the gentlelady is.
Mr. Chairman, I would seek unanimous consent to introduce the 800 son of this public health expert, invite individuals, the Attorney General's repeated interviews in which he suggested that our elections would be undermined, only reaction from election officials around the country, and the articles concerning these campaign donations.
Without objection, the articles will be, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, your department of Relations Alabama Board, the president's former campaign manager, early May out of concern for the coronavirus. In March 26th and April 3rd, your department released guidelines, criteria by which setting priorities by which people would be released early. By your own department's admission, did not meet that criterion. Since the start of this pandemic, we have repeatedly urged you to use your authority to protect vulnerable populations Instead, you released the president's former campaign manager.
Yep.
Sir, do you know how many federal inmates have tested positive for COVID-19 as of today?
I have that number.
Quickly, sir, because the clock ticks.
No.
Well, we have a slide, they'll bring it up, that shows us that 10,000 inmates have tested positive and over 1,000 staff have tested positive. Do you know how many have died?
Of course not.
About 100. It's almost 100, I think.
That's right. It's about 99 inmates have died, and yet only 5% have been released guidelines.
7,000.
You stated in May that you were taking, quote, every measure we can to protect federal inmates. The numbers tell a different story as to your actions. Despite releasing Manafort, your lawyers continue to argue against the release of prisoners. In April, vulnerable prisoners who suffer from serious at-risk health conditions like chronic asthma, heart disease, and kidney disease filed for early release in Ohio. These prisoners were being, quote, overcrowded in like cattle because prisoners were not able to social distance. 550 prisoners sought release, yet your own department processed only 7 applications and denied.
Wow.
Yet you had time to process Manafort's application.
I didn't
But
process
apparently-
Manafort's.
Well, your department did, sir.
Thank you.
But apparently not these Americans living at great risk. In fact, in a series of rulings in April and May, an Ohio District Court ordered that your department act with urgency and to, quote, move inmates out due to continued risk of harm to prisoners and to government staff. And sir, your department challenged that court order, did not?
Yep.
I'm not familiar with
I'm not
Well, you
familiar.
all did. You did not help inmates out as ordered. In fact, you tried to block the district court's order.
He's a
However, the
liar.
Supreme Court on May 26 rejected
Please,
the department. Sir, 9 prisoners have died, and it's been 2 months since the Supreme Court's order. Do you even know today how many of those were released or how many more have died?
No, I don't. You know, we had 100, we started out this with 170,000 prisoners. So we've lost.
I just need to explain to me and to America, how is it that the former campaign manager of the President of the United States did not meet the priority criteria, got released, even though your own department admitted he didn't meet the guidelines, but all these other folks were not. If it was heavy enough virus that you needed to protect the former campaign manager, why not all of these Americans who also have are vulnerable and have at-risk conditions? Mr. Barr, the contrast says it all. And it is not just in Ohio. In fact, in my own home, Texas, a federal prison housing women with mental and medical health issues just confirmed last week that of the 1,000 prisoners, over 500 tested positive for COVID. One prisoner recounted, "We're like a whole bunch of hamsters in the chasing our own tails, and yet none have been released." Mr. Barr, have you seen those statistics? Yes or no?
I put out guidelines, general guidelines to propel the release of. I put out general guidelines.
Prisoners, Andrea Circle Bear, who had to give birth on a ventilator in that facility because your department prioritizes releasing all men instead of vulnerable Americans. A few weeks after this photo, Ms. Bear died, along with 2 other women housed in this facility from COVID-19. Sir, you could be saving lives by reducing the prison population. Yet you have blatantly abandoned your duty to these women. You have shamelessly abandoned your to protect all Americans impartially because you have prioritized giving special favors to the president's friends. This is not equal justice under the law. Not the law that you and I both learned in law school. It is 2 simple systems of justice, one for the president's friend and one for everyone else.
Director of the
It's
BOP,
flat wrong.
yeah, the
Thank you,
direct,
and I yield back.
yeah, the director of the BOP testified under oath that no one from Justice Department was.
Yields back, I mean, but the gentleman has not been given an opportunity to respond. There's been a consistent problem.
Mr. Nagu.
It's her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General. I want to go through a couple of your prior statements. On April 18th of 2019, you stated, quote, that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You're aware of that? Mm-hmm. Today, yes or no, Mr. Barr, under the penalty of perjury, do you testify that was true at the time you made it?
I thought it to be true at the time.
I thought it to be true.
Why isn't it true?
I'll get to that.
Does it have
Mr.
to
Barr,
with
I will
legal
get to that.
record?
Reclaiming my time, you answered the question. I have another question for you. On
Thank
June
you.
19th,
No, actually, I need to answer that question.
Mr. Attorney General,
No, you said under penalty of perjury. I'm going to answer the damn question.
you
okay?
said the answer
And-
was
and-
yes, is what you said.
Well-
Are you saying no?
I think what I was referring to, and I have text of it, was the supplying of documents.
No, Mr. Attorney General, the statement was not limited to the supply of
I-
documents. You
I
stated
think
at a
that's
press,
what-
Mr. Attorney
I
General,
think
reclaiming
that's
my
what I was
time.
talking.
I
think that's what I was talking about.
On April 19th of 2019, that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You knew when you made that statement that the president did not agree to be interviewed by the special counsel. Now, on June
I
18th
think I
of this year,
subsequently
Mr.
said
Attorney
I
General,
was referring to
on June 18th,
production of documents.
Mr. Attorney General, of this year, the Department of Justice issued a statement saying that Mr. Berman, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, had, quote, aware of that statement being released by the department, correct?
Yeah.
And do you testify today that that statement was true at the time the department issued it?
Better not
He may
lie.
not have known it, but he was stepping down.
He may not have known that he was stepping down. That's your testimony today?
He was being removed.
Mr. The statement did not say that he was being removed. It did not say that he was being fired. It said that he was stepping down. Apparently, your testimony today is that when Mr. Berman has testified under oath to this committee, that it in fact was not. Now, I want to talk.
No, he was removed. He was removed, and I wanted an opportunity for another job.
I understand your rationalization
the next
for your
day.
answer that the American
It's
people
not a
will let
rationalization.
you
Yes, it
speak
is.
for itself. Mr. Attorney General, earlier this year, Trump stated that he had planned to make what he described as Vice President's, quote, Ukraine dealings an issue on the campaign trail. Earlier this year, on February 10th, that you had set up a, quote, intake process for submission of information, intake process, end quote, for submission of information relating to the Justice Department, and that included, quote, these are your words, anything Mr. Giuliani might provide. You recall making those comments?
Something along those lines.
See, there isn't anything standard about the Attorney General creating a special process for information related to advancing.
I disagree.
You disagree.
And I also made it clear that the vetting process that's available to anybody.
Is that right? Which U.S. attorney have you assigned to receive information from Vice President Biden's personal lawyers regarding President?
Well, maybe if they had vetted the dossier.
There's no.
Maybe if they vetted the dossier,
there is
we
no
wouldn't,
U.S.
we wouldn't have the whole.
Mr. Attorney General, there's no U.S. attorney to do that.
What are
What
you
you
talking
have
about?
done with respect to this process is unprecedented. Now,
It was cautionary so that we do not pollute the criminal investigative process with this
I will give
information.
you an opportunity to explain this intake process. My understanding is that you have directed.
You are going to give me an
that you-
opportunity?
I intend to right now. The Eastern District, the U.S. attorney responsible for that district, my understanding is that you have asked that U.S. attorney to be responsible for the intake process. Is that right?
No.
That's wrong. The U.S.
Attorney in the Eastern District was given oversight of all Ukrainian-related cases, any new cases involving Ukraine.
Correct.
We face a problem with Ukraine. Unreliable information coming in.
I appreciate
There's a lot of corruption there. It's a hall of mirrors.
Mr. Attorney General.
And I wanted to make sure that before we got into criminal things, and this was to everyone's benefit, particularly Vice President
Mr. Attorney
Biden,
General,
that the information was scrubbed
I appreciate
in
you
conjunction
noting
with
that,
the
and that is
intelligence
consistent
community.
with the memo that you said any and all new matters relating to Ukraine shall be directed exclusively to the Eastern District of New York for investigation and appropriate handling, just as you described right now. Now, of course, the U.S. attorney responsible in the Eastern District of New York was recently changed. My understanding is a few weeks ago, you announced that Seth Ducharme would be taking over to replace Donahue. Mr. Ducharme, prior to
Pittsburgh
serving
is in charge of the vetting.
I'm Mr. Attorney General, prior to taking this position, Mr. Ducharme worked at Maine. Is that correct?
Yes, he was a counselor in Maine.
He was a counselor.
And then he was the principal assistant deputy to the Attorney General.
That's right. Having the acting U.S. Attorney, the deputy U.S. Attorney, rather, in that district.
They wanted to swap jobs.
You now have appointed your prior counsel to oversee that very same. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman yields back. Ms. McFadden.
Mr. Chairman, before we go to Ms. McFadden, I enter, ask for unanimous consent to enter 4 documents of the 2 memos I referred to, setting the guidelines for who gets released, a article about 12 that of course release, and a testimony from the council official local 333 of record.
Ms. McFadden, now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking you, Attorney General Barr, for joining us today and for the work that the committed department are doing to keep our country safe. But sir, just a few months ago in May, you said that you would be taking the president's position and urging the court to overturn the Affordable Care Act. When asked if you will still take that position, even if it means, and I quote, stripping of Americans of their health care in the middle of a pandemic, you stated that the case would not be argued until October, and that the president expects to fix and replace Obamacare with a better system. Attorney General Barr, let's be very, very clear. As public health officials and data have shown us, this pandemic is simply not going away. Just last week, it was reported that one hospital to send coronavirus patients home to die due to limited resources to treat them. So we're still facing a critical and extremely serious situation. And even if you expect the president to figure out a new plan by October, not yet put in place another system, nor is there any guarantee that he will do so by October, as you quote. So when you say you expect the president to figure out a new plan, you are taking a risk with millions of Americans. You are risking the lives of millions. People will not be covered for pre-existing conditions if the Supreme Court position. Civil servants in your own department have disagreed with you on this matter. In fact, introducing a statement by one of the lead attorneys on the ACA case, Joel McElvain, who resigned in protest when your department refused to defend the law as it is required. In my district, the 6th District of Georgia, congressional district, 300,000 people that have pre-existing conditions, and I, sir, am one of them, a 2-time breast cancer survivor. Our state is continuing to battle hard against a resurgence in COVID-19 cases. So I'm asking you, sir, not to gamble with American lives, not to gamble with my life. And I'd like you to confirm that the president has no other plan in place by October. You will reverse course and drop your position that, I quote correctly, the entire ACA must fall.
I have 2 children who are cancer survivors. I feel very strongly about this issue as a matter of policy, and I believe that the president's made clear that he will ensure that
Sir,
there will.
please answer my question. Will you stop playing politics with
Well,
Americans' health care in the middle of a pandemic?
I'm not playing politics. I'm the lawyer in charge of healthcare
Will
policy.
you reverse your course and make sure that millions of Americans like me that depend on healthcare and treatment stay alive? Will you reverse your course to make sure that we have the ability to be able to live in this country freely with quality healthcare?
People will have the healthcare protection. And that will be accomplished either if I lose,
Okay,
if the
so
government,
I
if the
take
government
this as
loses the
no.
case,
I
if this
take-
writes it down, and I
I
think,
take this as a no.
based,
Sir, I
no,
wanna
based on
briefly go
history,
on.
there will be.
Sir, I'd like to go on. I'd like to briefly mention my concerns relating to gun violence, because that's
Relating to
Washington. I want to briefly go on to another concern that I have relating to gun violence. That's
Okay.
actually how I got here.
Okay.
During the coronavirus, the nation has seen a dramatic increase in firearm sales and skyrocketing numbers of sales blocked by failed background checks. In March alone, the NICS background check system blocked 23,000 attempted sales. In other words, in 1 month, there were 23,000 attempts to get a firearm by a person who was not allowed to possess one under our current law. And it is a federal crime for anyone to lie in an attempt to get a firearm, which is what I suspect most people try to do. I'd like to know from you, how many of these market sales were investigated?
I sent out a directive that we should start prosecuting to the extent we can these lie and try. Previously, we hadn't really been pursuing.
Okay, so I take that as a no. I just don't want.
No, I'm saying we are pursuing those
My
cases.
time is up. I take that as a no. Unfortunately, this is a pattern of your administration neglecting the health and safety of Americans. From healthcare to gun violence, this administration is failing to keep my constituents and people all over the country healthy and safe. I demand better. Americans demand better. I want you to provide the answers that you are either unwilling to provide us or don't have to this committee, because these are relevant questions and we need to have answers from you. Now you're back to balance.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I got a question.
Jim?
What purpose is the gentleman speaking? For months, you've tried to get the Attorney General to come. He's here. Why don't you let him speak? Why don't you let him answer the questions?
Gentleman is not.
For time. If you want the Attorney General to come, at least let him answer the questions and the accusations made against him.
The gentleman's rudeness is not recognized.
Rudeness.
Stanton,
Time after time, you refuse to let the Attorney General of the United States answer the questions posed
Yeah,
to
y'all
him.
just talk about 20 years
Well,
ago.
maybe the last few witnesses will actually
Not
let the Attorney
America.
Mr. Stanton is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Attorney General. Thank you very much for
Who is
being here.
this?
Since the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1995,
It's gonna be.
those who have
This
sought to suppress the minority vote conceal their intention. The suppressors suggest that they were really out to advance some old goals such
Mr.
as election
Stanton.
security. But history has proven that those allegations and those rationalizations were lies designed only to fend off legal challenges. It was a dirty little secret. And those who aimed to suppress the minority vote never dared to say it out loud. Not Donald Trump. He didn't even try to keep it a secret.
Yeah.
He just blurted it out. He said he will lose the 2020 election if more Americans are able to vote. That's one reason why this president needed a fixer at the Department of Justice. Letting Russia off the hook to rewarding Roger Stone. Mr. Barr, you've proven not only very willing, but I have to admit, very. More than a year ago, this committee heard testimony about a resurgence of discriminatory voting practices, certain states making it difficult to vote. These practices include unnecessarily strict photo ID requirements and the abuse of signature match requirements to reject absentee. Despite that, your department has a lax approach to enforcing Voting Rights Act. During your tenure, you filed just one case to do so. The DOJ has done nothing to block the suppression practices we heard about over a year ago before this committee. And to your credit, Mr. Barr, you warned us. You told the New York Times Magazine earlier this spring that the DOJ's role in protecting the right to vote would be limited this year and that it would be states to police themselves. Isn't that right? Yes or no?
Saying that.
It's in the New York Times article from just last month. In that same, you said it would be up to the voters to referee the election. Is that right? Yes or no?
I don't remember the context.
Good.
Our influence.
All right.
No, sir. I'll submit it for the record. You'll have a chance to review it and submit additional testimony if you desire to. Someday, when we have more time, You'll have to see how a person whose right to vote is denied by a discriminatory practice can referee an election.
That doesn't
But I digress. It troubles me that you are consistent in your approach. As the Attorney General, you have stood down on discrimination and allowed states to make it harder to vote. But you have used it as a sword when attempts have been made to make it easier to vote. Voting rights advocates in South Carolina and Alabama sought to prevent Americans between voting and risking their health by making it easier and safer to complete an absentee ballot during the pandemic. But your DOJ to try to block that accommodation. Mr. Barr, did you discuss either of those cases with the president?
We're gonna find out.
The American people.
Live.
I don't even know. What two cases are you talking?
Oh.
Cases
Back
of,
pedal.
Tell me the name of the cases.
in the cases.
Where
South
were they?
Carolina and Alabama. They'll
Live
just comment
and backtrack.
after your testimony is done here today. The American people have good reason to believe continue to use your authority to carry out the
Fleshing his
president's
mouth.
wishes to suppress the vote.
Like,
And there are fears that you and the president are laying the foundation to interfere with the upcoming election, specifically with vote by mail, as my colleagues have previously noted, because both of you have advanced false conspiracy theory about mail-in voting. And I hope we can put some of those fears to rest here today. Mr. Barr, can you commit to the American people that you will not interfere in decisions of state and local authorities to use vote by mail and absentee ballots in the 2020 election?
Yeah.
That's a yes or no question.
I think the federal government has limited ability to get involved in this, but I'm not going to give up whatever ability we have to ensure the integrity of the election. I've never, my observation would inject some uncertainty into the election process, and it opens up the
That's where I got
potential of fraud. And I think the integrity of our elections is
Mr. Barr,
very important.
the president that only votes counted on election day should be what matters. Meaning that if a voter casts a legal ballot on or before election day, but that ballot is not counted on election day, it shouldn't count at all. So I want to ask you again about your commitment to ensuring that every vote is counted. If in this upcoming November election, the president asks you to intervene and try to stop states from counting legal ballots after election day, will you do the right thing and refuse? Yes or no?
I will follow the.
You won't say no, sir?
I'll follow the law.
It's very disappointing.
If a state has a law that says it has to be cast on election, that's the law.
Will you commit to making sure the Department of Justice does not get involved in a contested election? Yes or no?
I will follow the law.
It's so disappointing we can't get a clear answer on that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the following items. An item from the Guardian magazine, an embarrassment. The department goes quiet on voting rights. Second, New York Times magazine, William Barr, state of emergency. Finally, from the Washington Post, Trump's assault on the election integrity forces. What would happen if he refused to accept the law?
That objection, the material will be made.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record,
That objection.
a member of the Judiciary Committee,
That objection.
following the law should be something a member of the Judiciary Committee knows.
The gentleman.
It's pretty darn clear.
The gentleman will suspend that objection. The incident to the record, Ms. Dean is recognized.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, could we take a 5-minute?
Dean is recognized.
Could we take a 5-minute break, Mr. Chairman?
No, that's a, Ms. Dean is recognized of every witness.
I waited an hour for you this morning. I haven't had lunch. I'd like to take a 5-minute break.
Mr. Chairman, we are almost finished. We're going to be finished in a few minutes. Otherwise, we can certainly take a break, but,
You're real.
yeah, after this, if you still want, we'll have a break.
No, he wants a break now,
Right now?
and you just mentioned rudeness. I think we're seeing it. Hey, let's let the Attorney General have a break.
The committee will stand in recess now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wow. 5-minute break. Let me tell you. I've been doing this, They go an hour and a half. And I watched about an hour and a half before I started recording. William Barr is lying. He is not doing the right thing in our country. And there's some documentation somewhere to prove it. Someone has got to pull it out and get him removed. He does not. Look at the Epstein. Look at everything. He all these giant cases, and within 24 hours he decides, oh, there was no bearing. It is not cool.
House Judiciary Committee taking a short 5-minute break. They are almost wrapped up today's oversight hearing. William Barr will stay here for live coverage as the committee will gavel back in, and let you know also too, the entire hearing re-airs tonight at Eastern here on C-SPAN. We anticipate to being able to bring you live coverage later this afternoon of the President's News Conference from the White House, and that's scheduled for 5 Eastern.
The president is going to talk about nothing but how many masks. The funny thing is, like, they changed how we see how many cases come in, but the deaths are rolling so high, it looks worse for them. He's getting his dictator points from Putin, how to control the masses in a communist-style fashion, controlling the television, or controlling the having weird troops on our streets attacking the people who would have already gone home if they weren't there. It's a shambles. Nobody has a job. Nobody has insurance. We're turning on each other to save face. That party is obviously being run by criminals and perverts right now. And that's not to say that it can't, because it should. Right? People need to get back in there and defend that party. Because it looked really bad. And you got people like Jim Jordan up there and Olympian hands there for us to disrupt, make sound bites for the news tonight, make it seem like pour down. He's a divider. He is the head of the wrestling at Ohio State University that 170 college students went to report sexual abuse by the coach, and he ignored them. That's who the heckler is in this meeting. That's who it is. Crying is pervert. It's unreal. Really defending fucking tax break, I think. I didn't get it.
The committee will reconvene. Ms. Dean is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Attorney General Barr. I'd like to return and describe or discuss some different
Spinning
issues
his
regarding
pen,
June 1st
mouth
and
is
last month's
clenched.
square, where, as you
He's
know,
really
peaceful
bad.
gather over days and hours to discuss civil rights, to discuss
Madeline
heinous
Dean,
murder
Pennsylvania,
of George Floyd,
Democrat, 4th
culture,
District.
equality, and justice. When asked about the use of force displayed in the video against the protesters at Lafayette Square, you stated that your attitude was, quote, get it done. Let's move it done. If you'll take a look at the timeline we have compiled, we see that you were spotted in Lafayette Square at 6:10 p.m. that Monday. The president was scheduled to speak in the Rose Garden at 6:15. The park police began to disperse protesters at roughly 6:33. And Trump started his speech at 6:43 and finished at 6:50. So by 7:01, when the president was ready to walk across the street to take a photo in John's church, the square was cleared and ready for him to go. Am I correct?
Yes.
The timing is clear. Multiple local officials confirmed the point of clearing the square. One safety official said it was as if the park police's plan to move the perimeter had been, quote, hurried, and the president needed to walk to church. And just today, Congress heard testimony from Adam DeMarco, a National Guard officer deployed at Lafayette Square. He expected the square to be cleared after the curfew, after 7 p.m.
I'm sorry, who was that?
Adam DeMarco, National Guard. In the afternoon, I didn't have a question for you, sir. In the afternoon, you told us that you learned of the president's interest in crossing the square to go to the church. Is it your opinion, Mr. Barr, that clearing protesters from Lafayette Square, which local officials were told to hurry up moments before the president's photo op with a Bible in front of a church, was coincidence? Is this timing coincidence?
I believe it is. Yes, it's not coincidence. Post hoc, after hoc. Is that what you're saying?
Latin. In a related matter, when asked about the use of pepper bombs,
It wasn't a coincidence, if you would permit me, Congressman. Okay, as I said, I use the analogy of MacArthur at late takeoff.
We heard
Okay,
that.
yeah. Okay, so
Mr.
you couldn't have walked.
Said coincidence. Fine. We'll assume that that was all coincidence. In a related
I've
matter,
already
when asked
explained that
about
it had been planned all
this,
day.
Attorney, the time is fine. We waited a long time for you to come here. The time is fine.
You waited to talk to me like this? You didn't need to wait
When
so
asked
long.
about the use of pepper bombs fired at Americans in Lafayette Square, you said, quote, no, there were no chemical irritants. Pepper spray is not a chemical irritant. It's not chemical, quote.
So I was referring to a dichotomy,
Actually,
in these kinds of things between chemical compounds and naturally occurring substances.
Attorney General, there are rules by which
Cocaine?
we operate here. I would ask you to respect.
Heroin?
Take a look at the screen. I placed on this screen for reference as you how your department describes pepper balls used on Americans in Lafayette Square. The 2009 Justice Report noted that the pepper ball, quote, system's accuracy in blunt trauma impact made it an ideal chemical dispensing system. So while you, in a quote, said it's not chemical, you today confirm it's chemical, and you're aware of your department's policy, are you not?
What policy?
Oh my God.
Provided.
What does it say? What's the policy?
Well, I showed it to you. Finally, whether or not you authorized it at the time. Perhaps you weren't listening.
The policy. What was the policy
Clearly
in
you weren't
there?
listening. Fine. Whether or not you authorized the use of pepper balls. What? I did not ask you a question yet, sir. I asked you to please refrain from interrupting me. We watched videos played across the news and social media showing that these chemical irritants were used on protesters. So yes or no, and this is a yes or no, sir. Have you begun an investigation of the use of excessive force in Lafayette Square?
I think the IG is looking at everything related to, the
So the
anti-rioting.
answer is yes, you are.
The IG is investigating.
Tragically, what happened in Lafayette Square is no longer an isolated incident. Use of chemical irritants has been used in more than 90 cities. My colleague showed you the video of the Navy vet being pepper sprayed and beaten to his bones frozen. Whether this was appropriate at the time, have you now called for law enforcement to stop using these chemical irritants? Yes or no?
Pepper spray?
No?
I think it's a very important non-lethal option.
For protesters?
No, for
Sir,
rioters.
that was my question.
Rioters.
Yes.
Sir, America
You don't
is
know the
founded on
difference.
principles of free speech.
When people resist law enforcement, they're not peaceful.
Explaining my time. I'm so lack of respect for a member of Congress.
Yeah, time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms. McCarcel Powell.
Mr. Barr, good afternoon. I mentioned Latin America a little bit earlier. You know, many of my constituents that I represent in Florida fled to America from countries that used deadly force to speech, and they used armed forces to suppress dissenting voices. They cherish our Constitution, as other Americans have done for generations, because of the incredible freedoms and rights that being an American citizen gives to all of us. It's extremely personal to me because I know that my roots are in Ecuador, but I live by the American Constitution. And it's true that those who are fortunate enough to always have these freedoms sometimes cherish them even more than those who have always had them. When they see photos from Portland, they don't see the American ideal or the American home. They actually see and are reminded what they left behind. You would agree with me on that? Are you listening? Take a look at this.
Who's the subject of that last sentence?
Just, you know, when
Who
you
honor-
see, look at these videos for 1 second. We have Venezuela at the hands of Maduro, firing tear gas at protesters and using brutal to crush demonstrations. That's what we see from dictators on both the left and the right.
Big ass.
But it's hard to distinguish these photos from those events and from the videos that we've seen by U.S. federal police in Portland tear gassing and photos of a peacefully protesting U.S. Navy veteran. Very similar. So, Mr. Barr, how do you restore the confidence of constituents in the values of this country when every night on television they're seeing these images of violence used against the peaceful protesters? We all do. How do you restore the trust in our democracy?
I think that the forces being rioters in situations where protesters are not following police direction.
The protests have been peaceful, Mr. Barr. You know that. You know that. You're
I
just
don't know
using
what that-
language for political purposes,
No,
just
I
like
don't
my
know what
colleagues
that- I don't
across
know
the.
what-
Let me just go now to one of the most important topics facing our nation right now: healthcare. You know, in my district, we have close to 100,000 people that get their health insurance through. 19,000 of them are living with serious pre-existing conditions, and yet you are working to strip their healthcare at the moment when the coronavirus is killing thousands of people in my state.
They will
In
not be
Miami-Dade
stripped of their
County
health.
and in Monroe counties that I represent, people have died from COVID-19.
No, I don't.
1,410 people. You were at the White House on March 23rd when President Trump, Governor DeSantis, was doing an incredible job. Do you agree that Governor DeSantis is doing an incredible job?
Well, I have no reason to believe that.
Well, Florida now has more cases than in China.
Well, did
And
Cuomo,
in
did
fact,
Cuomo
we
do an
have
incredible
Florida,
job in New York?
unfortunately, and I'm not proud to say this, we have more cases than most countries combined around the world. So no, he is not doing an incredible job. You push states to open too soon. You with lawsuits.
I didn't
If
ask
they-
states
if
to
they
open.
said-
I didn't ask states to open.
You threaten with lawsuits for those states
For
that want to
church.
have stay-at-home orders, Mr.
For things
Barr.
like church.
We have the facts.
I'm just
And
saying.
now the country, the United States of America, has more than 4.3 million COVID cases alone. You, Mr. Barr, and President Trump, working together, are letting my constituents down. And it's something that you are going to have to live with. What am I supposed to my constituents when they ask me if the government has done everything in its power to protect their loved ones from dying? You tell me, Mr. Barr, what am I supposed to tell them?
I would tell them that managing this kind of thing requires a lot of difficult choices, weighing different
I'm not gonna
And
lie.
that is, and that is
I am
left,
not gonna lie to my
and that is
constituents.
left
I am going to
in our
tell them
system of
that
government
President
to
Donald
the
Trump
governor.
and the Attorney General working together, not following health guidelines, they're letting Americans die needlessly because of political reasons. That is what I will tell
In our system,
Thank you. And one last question, if I can.
in our system.
Under oath, do you commit to not releasing any report Durham before the November election?
No.
You don't commit to that?
No.
So you
I will
won't
be
go
very
by
careful.
Department of Justice policy
I know
that,
Justice
that you
Department
won't
policy.
in any political investigations before the November election?
We're not going to interfere. In fact, I've made it clear I'm not going to tolerate.
But under oath, you're saying that you not commit to not releasing a report by Durham?
I'm not going to, any report will be, in my judgment, not run by the policy and disrupt the election. I've already made it clear that neither
You would go against your own Department of Justice policy, Mr. Barr.
Why don't you tell me what that policy? Well, actually,
Do you want me to repeat it for you?
I know the policy.
Yeah.
Lady, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. I
Go
yield
ahead,
back.
go
I
ahead.
yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, point of order. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Is it permissible for a member of this committee to accuse the sitting attorney general of murder? Because that's what we just heard. Those words need to be struck from this record. This is outrageous. Mr. Chairman, to say whatever they want. What about rule? Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, I actually have a clarification. Mr. Chairman. I just,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Chairman.
was the video played by this member, was that a video of things that happened in the United States or in Venezuela? I just want a clarification. What was the video?
Gentleman is not stating a nice point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, the administration, against the constitutional text, historical precedent, and DOJ's own memo, is to exclude undocumented persons from the census, an action that harms American lives and immigrant communities, and American communities. Here, many American children are living with an undocumented parent or relative. This change in the census means that those children, American children, receive less money for programs like the National School Lunch Program, Head Start, and or the State Children's Health Insurance Program. A note, please, Mr. Barr. Are you comfortable with the decision that would punish American children and immigrant communities in this way?
I don't make the policy. I provide legal advice on legal issues. So
Okay.
as both to this issue and the issue of the ACA, the question for the department is the
Barr,
law.
reclaiming my time, sir. Mr. Barr, a simple yes or no. Does the Constitution say that only citizens should be counted in the census? Correct. It does not. In fact, the framers of the 14th Amendment explicitly confronted this question, and it provides that persons in each state be counted. I'll move on.
Well, they wouldn't have,
Among
they wouldn't
many
have
others,
confronted
there's
it
no
because there were no illegal aliens.
Among many other things, I'm alarmed by your department's refusal to comply and implement key Supreme Court rulings. On June 18th of this year, the Supreme Court, in an opinion authored by Chief Justice Roberts, ruled that the Trump administration attempt to rescind DACA was arbitrary and capricious and required the administration to process new DACA applications. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling, DACA applications have been processed. That's not the only Supreme Court decision your administration has made.
Yeah.
In 2017,
Was
the
it-
department issued a that transgender workers were not protected by civil rights laws. The Supreme Court struck that down.
No, I'm sorry.
In both,
But we,
No,
the 64 Act did not extend to.
reclaiming my time, sir. In both DACA and transgender decisions, your department has yes or no. Will the department implement the Supreme Court's DACA and transgender rulings?
I guess I think we are.
The DACA ruling? You are now processing DACA applications?
I think what we're trying to do now is restore the administrative process. DHS has put out a rule. I think DHS put out a rule
Thank
today.
you, sir. Sir, earlier you testified.
At least that's what I was told.
You testified that you discussed the president. Does the president tell you what he thinks the winning issues have been in his reelection?
discuss my
I'm not asking you to divulge anything private or classified.
Well, I think my
What's the
discussions with the president are confidential.
Have you?
But it shouldn't surprise you in an election year, the topic of the election comes up.
Well, it surprises me that the DOJ has become so politicized. So that's what surprised me. Sir, have you and the president ever discussed the fact that anti-immigrant and anti-LGBTQ policies excite his base? You've never had that conversation.
No.
He's never told you that his anti-immigrant policies, his anti-LGBTQ policies,
I haven't discussed that with him, but I assume the immigration, I think a lot of his base does care about immigration policy.
does that motivate some?
Like what were?
Well, for example, your enthusiasm for
That position was taken on the transgender that you're talking about was taken before that litigation, I believe.
and you can reverse it any day. My question was whether
No, it was a legal question as to whether the 64 Act extended to transgender.
at a time, sir. One more question. You keep telling us that you're not aware of the president's tweets. Are you aware that your department has stated that the president's official White House statements?
No, it wasn't. I don't pay attention to the tweets unless they're brought to my attention.
Okay, Mr. Barr, thank you so much for being here today. I want to remind you of something. You probably don't remember, but some months ago, you actually were outside my office. You were coming out of my neighbor's office. I tapped you on the shoulder, and in a friendly reminder, I handed you a copy of the Constitution, and I asked you to please help us defend the Constitution. There's nothing more dangerous to our republic than an attorney general who refuses to uphold his oath, refuses to defend the Constitution, and swears allegiance to just one person, Donald Trump. Sadly, that's where we are today.
My loyalty is the Constitution. When I came into government.
Gentlelady yields.
The lady just accused him of not adhering to his oath of office. Let him talk. Holy, she just accused the attorney general of not adhering to his oath. Let the gentleman speak.
Even worse.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentlelady yields back. The ranking member asks whether the video shown by the gentleman part of the place in the U.S. or in Ecuador.
No, Venezuela.
That, sir, U.S. or Venezuela. That, sir, is precisely the point. This concludes
No, no, no.
here.
My point was it was Venezuela.
Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional materials to the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Oh, freaking toe, man. Oh. All right, well, I guess I'm in. It was fun. Canvas. Ooh, I like that. Canvas, my friend. I
In case you
canvas.
missed any of this, House hearing.
Come back for the president
online
speaking
anytime
and
at our
work on
website,
some of these
ceasefire.org.
pages. Ending stream.